Hi, I'm Andy Thompson. Welcome to our farm. My plan is to take you on a tour of the farm, and before I do that, I'll give you some geographic and historical background to it. This farm is situated north of Mount Bridges, Ontario. It's on the Caradoc Sand Plain, emphasis on the sand. It's the northern part of the Carolinian Forest Zone, which extends from a few kilometers north of here to Toronto, and then south to Tennessee. And that forest zone is correlated with the climate and weather. So as far as the history goes back thousands of years. The original people here were Native Americans. There were a variety of different tribes, as I understand, Hurons, Wyandots, and you still see evidence. Occasionally I find bits of chert here, and once I found an arrowhead. This would have been a prime place for them, up on this high land. It was wet down there. The land was ceded to the British Crown about 1829, as far as I can tell, and it was surveyed and settled by mostly Scots. In fact, if you look at some of the old cemeteries, the headstones say native of Argyllshire. There's so many headstones that say native of Argyllshire, you wonder if there's anyone still left in Scotland. But they came here about 1840s. They were allotted 100 acres per family, and one of the requirements was that they cleared land, and they did clear land. Not just this family, but every family in southern Ontario, to the extent that by the late 1800s, 85% of the forests were destroyed. I hope destroyed is not too strong a word, but they were gone. 70% of the wetlands were gone. And particularly on this sand land, that was a problem because the agricultural methods they used led to great amounts of soil erosion. Even up until 40 years ago, when I first came here in May, when they opened up the land, there'd be sandstorms. Now that's changed dramatically because of improved farming practices. They leave a lot of trash, what they call trash, on the surface. And together with the municipality, together with the St. Clair Regional Conservation Authority, I think Boy Scouts, a few others, planted great numbers of cedar trees that have tremendously changed the way the wind blows through, so we don't get the sandstorms that they used to have. So among the things I wanted to talk to you about around here, not just trees, but other plants, animals, birds, and one of the first things I want to point out to you is this coyote den. This is just built in the last couple of weeks. It's right beside my drive shed. It's not too far from the house. It's a great spot for them. It overlooks the valley. Deer move through here. I'm not too concerned about them. I think coyotes get persecuted unjustly, although I must admit, a couple of weeks ago when the cows were calving, it did cause me some apprehension when I heard the coyotes howling in the distance. However, I think the vast majority, there's far more livestock that dies because of mismanagement than ever has died through predation by coyotes or anything else for that matter. I'm not sure what we're going to do about him. He can stay here, I think, if he likes, but in the next little while we'll be tuning up chainsaws. We'll be doing a bit of rifle fire, and every Friday morning there'll be band practice with bagpipes. So he may not particularly like the location he's chosen to build a den. So along the line of talking about cedars, I'd like to talk about cedar rail fences. I built these cedar rail fences 20 years ago when I had some ambition. Most of these cedar rails came from east of Godrich, and they were split when that land was cleared. It was Queen's Bush. It was opened up about 1870. So many of these rails may be 140, 150 years old, but they're still intact. Not as strong as they were. Anyway, one of the things I like about these cedar rails fences is the 400 series for squirrels and chipmunks, and they're up and down here all the time. They make the connection up past the house to these cedar hedges here, and can continue on up to the woodlot that's one farm away. So it's established a connection, not just the rails, but the hedges. It's reestablished connection between the isolated pockets of remnant forest, or woodlots as we call them. This is a remnant cedar bush here. I've been told that it was much more extensive than this. In fact, the farm is called Cedar View by the original people, and I was told that when they put the hydro line through, I'm not sure when that would be, 30s, 40s, early 50s, that they opened up the face of the cedars and the wind blew them all down. However, there's still some remnant trees, and over the last 10 years I've been replanting them. I've grown them from seed and replanted them as little trees like that. That was a complete and utter disaster. They all died. So what I found is the only way to grow cedar here is to grow it up this high and then transplant it in the spring. So what you see here are, there's about 100 of them in here. You can't see them all. But what I find interesting is if you get north, up around Chatsworth, Owen Sound, cedars take over any abandoned land, whereas down here, they don't reestablish themselves. Maybe it's because the weeds are too tall, maybe because climate changed since they were established hundreds of years ago. Don't know, but they don't reestablish themselves. So this is my cedar nursery. It's 2 layers of snow fence to keep the deer out. And I grow them in here until they're about this height. And next spring I'll transplant them out, maybe April, early May. The reason I do that is because the deer will eat them to the ground if I don't grow them up this height. And they'll do well after this, but no point doing anything unless they're 6 feet high. This particular area is right close to the McDougall Creek, and it was farmed right up to the edge of the creek. I've moved back the arable land by planting white pines here. The idea is to prevent runoff from the farmland into the creek. These are white pines. They're planted in probably the only bit of clay on the farm. They're doing really well. I'm not sure how well they'll do for the next 20 years. I've also planted bur oaks. This is bur oak. It's only had 7 growing seasons, so it's doing really well. You notice that around the bottoms of them, this one here, and over here, there are wire cages. I'm not sure how many bur oaks I have along here, maybe 100. Each one of them is protected by a wire cage because the deer will smash them and eat them if they get a chance. So along the roadside here I've planted 75 sugar maples. Each and every one of them came out of the bush, so they're native right to this very farm. I planted them beginning, I planted them in November 2014, so they've had 8 years growth. They're really starting to go now. I've had difficulty with bucks smashing them down and voles eating them at the base. So I've probably replaced about 10. There's some that are still there that are damaged, but they seem to be coming on anyway. The idea for this is, when I was a kid, there were a lot of maple trees on roadsides in southern Ontario, and the reason for that is after they devastated the forest, they realized that they needed to do something. There are a couple of reasons for planting them. Number one, you could drive your team and stone boat along and collect the sap very easily in a row like this. The other is they were to provide some shade in the summertime and in the winter, which would allow, in the wintertime, allow the snow to drift so they could run their sleighs through. Those are the stories I get. The other is that it was a celebration of Queen Victoria's Jubilees in 1888, 1898, and if you planted a maple tree and it was still alive 2 years later, you got 50 cents from the government. So a lot of these trees have, in the rest of the province, they'd be 120 to 130 years old. They've often been damaged by utility crews and so on, and reached the end of their life and they're gone now. What we're driving past now is the other side of the road, and this was planted as a windbreak by Bill Blair, who was born in 1903, and they tell me he planted as a young man. And when I cut down some of the dead trees, I counted rings back to 1920. So probably he planted them as a, well, that corresponds well with the time frame, young man in the 1920s. They were mostly white pines, Norway spruce, and red pine, or not red pines, Scotch pines. But in the years, I've knocked down a lot of the Scotch pines, and maples have come up as the keys have drifted in and taken root. So it's become a maple windbreak to a large extent. And on the other side, George Deagle, who had the land just prior to us, among the 10,000 trees that he had from the ministry, he had cedars. So he's widened out the windbreak on this side with Norway pines, and the face of it is white cedar. And it really does protect this field. One of the pluses of this is that in the last few years, in the beginning of September, monarch butterflies congregate here in the hundreds. They get the morning sun, they get protection from the west wind, and they hang around here for 2 weeks, and all of a sudden they disappear. So they head to Mexico from here. This hay field has been here for about 10 years. I only take hay off it once a year. It was growing up with milkweed, so I went through and put Roundup on every one. That might offend a lot of people, but the reason I did that is, number one, doesn't make good hay. Number two is that it becomes a biological trap for monarch butterflies, because if they were laying eggs on this milkweed, we'd be taking the hay off. That would be a whole loss of a generation of butterflies. This area is what we call the South Pines. It's a couple or 3 acres of white pine that George Deagle planted 30 years ago. They've done really well. A lot of these trees are 75 or 80 feet high. They're still, I've been thinning them. I'm sure a forester would say I haven't been aggressive enough. But it is a bit overwhelming to knock down a tree and then see an open spot in the sky. So I take about half the trees I think I'm going to every year. So we've been doing that for a number of years. I prune them up as high as I can for aesthetic purposes. The other is to let the light in so we can get some undergrowth from it. Most of these places that have been planted in southern Ontario are stagnant in the sense that they weren't thinned, and the trees aren't doing anything, and there's too much darkness underneath, so there's no other trees coming up. These are all maples that have come up over here, and many of them I think have come from the other woodlot, but a lot of them came from the maple keys that I threw in here when I raked up the lawn and dropped the maples back here. So I'll show you what I used to prune these trees. So George Deagle planted these about 30 years ago, 1990, 1991. He was here a couple days ago, and I actually asked him why. This doesn't extend right to the bush. And I asked him why, and he said because he had some extra trees to his plantation down there, but he never did actually say why it doesn't extend. Anyway, he had extra trees. He put them up here, but he put them up on this land that used to be cornfield. But the highest point, just to the east of us, was the highest point on the farm, and open to the prevailing wind from the west. There are sand dunes along the old fence line, so it was an excellent idea to plant them there. Once again, it holds the soil and protects them from the wind. So I've been pruning these trees for about 10 years now, and this is one of my favorite tools. It's called a Jameson pole saw. This blade is razor sharp, and I mean razor sharp. That's not exaggeration. And it fits together like this. So I can get up that high like this. Because I have a very good friend. I have a very good friend who can use 2 of these, and I use 4 of them just to annoy him. I do this in the winter time. About an hour or 2 is enough when I'm tuning this high. It's a good exercise on a cold winter's day. It's always calm in here. The wind doesn't get you. This tree is a black cherry. I didn't plant it. It seeded itself in just about the time the plantation was, so it's about 30 years old. When the trees are really close together, they grew up very high, became spindly and tilted over the wind. So I put ropes on it 3 different ways and straightened it out, and it's growing very nicely. There's another one here beside it. My principle here is everything has to have a saw log or a veneer log in it, so hopefully that's one. Cherry is it's a pioneer species. It likes light. And the birds bring them in, and there are no end of them. So I moved out about 60 of these last year that were about that height, planted them in November over on the new plantation, and I'll show you what they look like this year. This is my Little Prairie. I took this out of production about 12 years ago because you barely turn a piece of equipment around then. You couldn't turn a piece of equipment around here now. And the land has been eroded by the wind to the extent that in July any corn that grew over there just turned brown and died. So I took it out of production. I got a bag of prairie seeds somewhere and I threw them down. And then a few years later I came back to see what was growing, and I had a variety of things. And since then I've introduced some things. This is called Big Blue Stem. There were 4 main prairie plants: Big Blue Stem, Little Blue Stem, Indian Grass, and Switchgrass. So the Little Blue Stem's about this high, the rest are this high. I have all 4 here, plus some minor ones. I have drop seed and Copacabana and Cyto Scama grass as well. They're in a battle against these European grasses. We burn it occasionally, very, very carefully. Just small bits of it. That seems to help. One of the most spectacular things happened this year was one day in July, about 10 o'clock in the morning, I came around the corner, beautiful sunny day, and there were scads of swallows. Most of them barn swallows. There were tree swallows. I think there might have been some what do you call them? Swifts. There was an indigo bunting, a cardinal, no end of different butterflies. A majority of them monarchs, but in numbers are monarchs, but there were no end of different butterflies, and huge dragonflies all flying through here. It was quite spectacular to see that just that much activity over a native area. You looked over the hayfield, not so much. You got up to the lawn, nothing. So it just indicates to me how important these wild areas are for plants and animals and insects in particular. So this is one of the big 4 prairie grasses. It's called Sorghastum nutriens, also known as Indian grass. I found this going along the railway tracks west of Mount Bridges and brought in some seeds, spread them about, and they seem to be quite happy here. These plants, these grasses here, the smaller ones, this is called Little Blue Stem, and it's establishing itself pretty nicely over here. So here's part of the problem I have to deal with is these European grasses. I think a lot of people don't appreciate that all the grasses we have in this country, other than the ones I just pointed out to you, came from Europe and the Mediterranean area. Because when the settlers first came, cleared the trees, there was no grass. This was a forested area. So in order to feed their livestock, they had to bring in grass from Europe. So we're entering here into 25 acres of almost primeval forest. This was logged very sparingly by the Blairs. I took 40 trees out myself, and I won't do it again. I'd rather have the big trees. There's some argument, people say, well, you should cut them and get some money for them, but I think we have a problem in Western culture is that we don't see the value in anything unless we can turn it into dollars and cents. And I'd rather have the pileated woodpeckers and the wood ducks than a pickup truck, so I like to keep the trees. So this is where we start with the maple syrup. I tap this group of trees right along the laneway. That's about as far as I can walk with a 5-gallon bucket. So the woods contains lots of sugar maple, shagbark hickory, white oak. There's a few red oaks on the edge, beech, cherry, and I would say it's probably classified as they used to call it a climax forest. I don't know what they call it now. It's infested with garlic mustard, as most woodlots are. I don't know what you do about that. So what we do have in the spring is just a carpet of something called a spring beauty, which is small pink and white flowers. They grow about this high. Their flowers about as big as my thumbnail. They come out when there's sunshine. You don't see them on a cloudy day, but it's a complete carpet of the whole woods. So this ridge runs about halfway through the area I tap. It's about 2 feet higher than my evaporator. So we tap these trees, and I tap into 5-gallon plastic buckets that I set on the ground, and we go through and gather the sap. I run a line from this collecting vessel here down to the evaporator, and then we pour it in here. So it's half gravity feed, saves a tremendous amount of work. This particular area was part of the pasture up until 1988, and it's regrown with maples. When we first came here, all these little maples were just this high, and now they're fighting their way up. They're 20, 30 feet. So this is a sugar shack that I built 20 odd years ago. It took me 4 years. My wife says it took me 8, but I'm sure it was just 4. It's post-and-beam construction. I spent a lot of time in old bank barns playing and working, and I thought I'd like to build a sugar shack, same method. So these beams, most of them came within 200 yards from this place. The only one that wasn't from this farm is that heating post over there. I cut them down and hewed them with a broad axe. That one was I hewed with an adze, and I cut all the joints with handsaw and old augers. And one day we had a barn raising and assembled the whole frame in 6 hours, although it took me 4 years to get to that point. The evaporator is stainless steel, state-of-the-art, 1865. It works well to make about 70 liters of syrup a year. We made 150 one time, and that turned into a job. So it's kind of fun to sit back here in March. March gets a bad rap as a month, but if you're back in the bush rather than out in the street in town, it's really a pretty nice place to be. And it's a bit of a communal focus in the spring. It's the first thing for people to do to get out in the spring is go out and see the evaporator. I love it when people bring their kids out. Kids turn feral and run all over the bush the way they're supposed to. So we make, like I say, we make 70 liters. We don't sell it. It costs too much to produce to sell it, so we give it away. I like maple syrup in coffee, so if you like a double-double, replace the sugar with maple syrup. I think you'll enjoy that. It's a pear tree, and when I was pouring the foundation, when you start pouring concrete, you can't quit until it's done. So one of my wife's friends brought me back a sandwich and a pear, and I ate half the sandwich, gave the other half to the dog, ate the pear, chucked it into the undergrowth, and several years later, I noticed there's a pear tree growing here. Now the rest of the story I'm not supposed to tell you, but I will anyway. At one point there were some young teenage boys had a bush party back here, and they burnt my pear tree right to the ground. And but the great thing about pears, they're really tough. So what do we do? No, I'm fairly militant about what grows on this property. I like native trees and Carolinian species only, but I'm willing to bend my principles for pear trees because it has a story. I took this area out of production about 12 years ago. I managed to square off the rest of the field. Once again, it's a small area. It's been windblown. It wasn't particularly productive. So I squared off the main hay field. I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do with this, whether I was going to leave it as a meadow or try to plant it in trees. I decided to plant it in hardwoods, and I decided I'd plant them the way the hardwoods would grow in the woods. That's not really an efficient way to use trees. So over on the new part, I've interplanted them with white pines, spread them out. But anyway, in order to keep the deer off, I put no end of barriers there, piled brush around them. One of the great things about piling a brush around them is it attracts little birds. I have no end of sparrows, native sparrows, no end of turkeys come in here. There was a duck tried to nest here. Both the turkey and the duck got wiped out by coyotes, but smaller birds nest in here. Indigo buntings, kingbirds, quite a variety of different things. And robins build nests in the lower branches of the trees. It really comes alive. It's I guess what you'd call a forest edge here. So my intention for the rest of it is to plant more hardwoods, but I'm going to spread them out and interplant them with white pines so that it's a better use of the hardwoods. Most of these hardwoods, a lot of these hardwoods will crowd each other out, but in the meantime, they'll grow up nice and tall and straight, and maybe my great granddaughter a lumber harvest so she could buy a pickup truck. So this area used to be a pasture, and George Deagle planted it with white pines. In the meantime, I've been adding a variety of different trees. One of the things I noticed over the years driving around the countryside was that in the 60s and 70s, the ministry planted white pines and they interplanted them with walnuts. I think the idea was as the walnuts grew up, they'd kill out the pines and become good logs. But I don't think that worked very well. The walnuts outcompeted the pines in many places, and they grew up with branches and stems all over that didn't really make a good log. So what I did, just for funsies, is I planted about 10 walnuts just from nuts through here. When the pines were about 10 years old, with the idea being that the walnut would really have to compete for light and push itself up straight. This is my best one. This tree is probably 22 years old. It's maybe 70 feet high, and it has a very clear bowl all the way up. It's thin. It's probably unstable if I was to cut the rest of these pines down, but it is, the stem is thickening up pretty nicely. Once again, it might make a veneer log for somebody at some time, but it was just, I just wanted to see if we could maybe do better than plant pines and walnuts together at the same time, and it would appear so far to be working. The trees on my left here are tamaracks. They're probably original tamaracks. I've been told by the original families that this area was a tamarack swamp, but since they've lowered the water level, cut down the tamaracks, they haven't regenerated. So there's two here. There's one on my neighbor's property, and there's one on my own property down by the sugar shack. It must have grown pretty thickly because this little barn up here is made out of tamarack, and the rafters on the main barn back at the house, which are really only about this thick but 30 feet long, are all tamarack. Tamarack's pretty much a rot-resistant wood. I've tried to grow a few, but too many rabbits and deer, they just cut them right to the ground. The other thing I'd like to point out to you over here is there's a beaver lives in here, and he's built a dam that it's been washed out several times. The first dam he built was made out of corn stalks and phragmites and a bit of dogwood. Really wasn't up to code, didn't last very long, and he's built a few more since. This one seems to be jam full of leaves, but it's holding back a fair bit of water. And the reason I like that is because it's a great place for ducks. There's mallards, wood ducks, and black ducks in here. The wood ducks, my buddy saw about 10 the other day. They arrive about the time we're making syrup, landing trees, build nests in the holes that the pileated woodpeckers make. And it was good to see that number, so that means you probably had quite a successful hatch of ducks this year. I really like wood ducks. They're very pretty. When they come back, they're really talkative. They fly like a missile, and they land in trees. I still can't get over the idea of a duck landing in a tree, but that's what they do. The other thing is, there's a blue heron here. He works his way up and down the creek. He goes down to my buddy's place and fishes in his pond, eats goldfish, and occasionally you see an eagle, and they seem to follow the stream from east to west, up high, and just lazily circle as they head down that way. Eagles are pretty rare, but in the last number of years, see them often enough, so I think that's a real plus. This area was planted this spring with the assistance of Alice's Alternative Land Use Studies, Conservation Authority. Alice is a great organization for coordinating Conservation Authority and people like me, and there are a lot of people out there who like the idea of planting trees but don't have a place to plant them, and so they can focus money from people like that and organizations such as foundations. Weston Foundation is a big supporter, and that channels those resources to guys like me who can plant trees. This is another area. It's about 5 acres that too small really to work with modern equipment, so I took it out of production. We planted, I think, 3,600 trees here this spring. Started on the 18th of May, finished on the 20th. It didn't rain till the 1st of June. Things were hot and dry, but I did go through and I watered everything once. But they've come along really well because we've had 5 months of rain since then. So this is the first year these tree pines have been in. They're planted in at 720 to the acre roughly. 30 years from now, they'll be like the trees I I just showed you. In the cages are white oaks, black cherry, there's some red oak, a bit of hickory, and over here there are maples. I planted about 40 maples last fall. Some of them did quite well. The ones closer to the woods got hit hard by gypsy moth this spring. They struggled and came back. They didn't look too good over the summer, but the buds on them are good. I expect that they'll be all right by next summer. I plan to plant about another 100 sugar maples in here this fall. So the idea of all these laneways was that it's just easier for me to water these trees. Fortunately, this year I only had to water them once, and I don't expect to have to water them in the future. Once they get a year growth under their belt, they're away. So I planted about 110 black cherry. Some of them from the Conservation Authority, some from my woodlot. That's maybe a little less than average growth for this year. This flea bane came up out of this cornfield last year. Looks like a mess, but I find it kind of handy for planting an acorn. You just pull it up like that, step it down. You don't even have to bend over and hurt your back. So I planted about 200 of these in the last week or so, just by doing it that way. The other thing I've done since I killed all the milkweed over in the hayfield, just gathered up some, watch yourself, some of these. There. Scattered it around. I think foresters would be horrified planting weeds in amongst the pines, but pines will get up, get past them, crowd them out, and for the next few years there'll be some habitat for butterflies. Cherry. And I showed you some black cherries out in the south pines and how they're about that high. That's about how high this tree was last fall when I planted it. It's done really well, and the one I'm really proud of is it's grown from that high this summer. I didn't think that was possible, but black cherry is a pioneer species, and it does really well in the open area. Some of the pioneer species that we used to have, ash and elm, aren't nearly as abundant as they used to be. So the idea of old field succession around here, I don't think works as well as it may have worked 50, 60 years ago. I think you actually have to be actively planting things in order to get a place afforested or reforested. But I'm delighted with my cherry trees. So Mary has asked me to talk a little bit about myself and why I'm interested in this sort of thing. I was born in Toronto, Ontario, not to be confused with Toronto on the island, just southeast of Cavendish. And my parents moved me out to Caledon in the early 50s, and I was raised there. It was wild, open country. We were expected just to be home by supper, and so we played in the creeks and the swamps and the bushes, and I really enjoyed that life. I have a couple of degrees in biology. I consider myself a naturalist, though I'm a poor scientist. I keep no records of anything. I enjoy being outdoors. My background's in, I'm a veterinarian by trade. My background's in a lot of livestock. We had a practice in town here for 34 years. Spent a lot of time driving up and down the back roads of Ontario, all hours of the day and all seasons of the year, and observed things and how they grew and how they interacted. And I think of myself as a biologist more than anything. I look at things from a biological perspective, I like the interaction of light and soil and plants and trees and time, and I just find that fascinating. And so when we got this farm, I stepped up from George Deagle's idea and carried on with planting trees, not just planting trees, but maintaining them, growing them, pruning them, protecting them, and seeing the consequences in terms of wildlife, particularly birds, seeing how in some places it changed the soil, made it much more, restored the soil in many cases. So I have a very good friend, and he's a psychiatrist, and he's planted thousands of trees as well over the years. And one day he said to me, "Andy, tree planting is a disease." And I must have looked horrified, because then he said, "But fortunately, there's no cure," which I thought was a lovely thing to say. So I'll leave you with that. Thanks very much for coming on the tour with me.